Good evening. Thank you for joining us in this beautiful venue. We are thrilled to welcome Jamie Ford, author of The Many Daughters of Afong Moy, to the Patricia Reser Center for the Arts as part of our 6th annual community-wide read, One Book One Beaverton. We would like to recognize the new friends of the Beaverton City Library and the Reser for their very generous support of our program. We also want to offer thanks to the many library and city staff who have helped make One Book happen. I'd like to give special appreciation to staff members Beth Gilbert, Emma Jones, Blaine Ross, and to Jenny Chamberlain, my One Book partner in crime. And finally, to all of you for your support of One Book and the library, we can't thank you enough. Okay, so we have a few housekeeping things before we get started. This event is being recorded and it will be shown on the library's YouTube channel. Please silence your cell phones now if you have not done so already. And we would love to get your feedback about One Book, so if you could take a minute to fill out the online survey on the library's website, we would greatly appreciate that. There will be time for a Q&A with the author, so please write your question on the index cards that were handed out as you walked in, and ushers will be by to pick them up at the end of Mr. Ford's talk. We will also be including questions that were sent to us in advance, and we will try to get to as many questions as time allows. And finally, we invite you to join us in the lobby after the program to get your book signed by the author. Copies of Afong Moy and the author's other titles will be available for purchase, courtesy of local bookstore Jan's Paperbacks. We give a big shout out to Lori from Jan's for handling book sales for us tonight. The Many Daughters of Afong Moy first drew us in with its intriguing back and forth in time storytelling of the lives of 7 generations of Chinese women. We soon recognized that it also contained much to spark interesting community discussions. It seemed a natural choice with its themes of inherited trauma and mental health, climate change, family bonds, Buddhism, and the Chinese American experience. And what an enjoyable read. With his skillful and gripping writing, Mr. Ford brings alive a fascinating cast of characters in this haunting tale of love lost and found. Jamie Ford is the author of 4 novels. His debut novel, Hotel at the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, spent 2 years on the New York Times bestseller list and went on to win the 2010 Asian Pacific American Award for Literature. We are honored to have him with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jamie Ford.
Holy cow, look at you. This is amazing. If you'll just indulge me for one moment, could I have you bring the house lights up? Just a skosh? All right, okay. Everyone smile and say Facebook. Cool, thank you. Quick question, who's on Facebook? Ooh, who's on Twitter? Who's on Instagram? Who's not on anything? All right, cool, all right. Our species will survive. Another quick question, and again, there's no right or wrong answer, but I'm always a little curious. Who here might have read my first novel, Hotel? Oh, wow, okay, cool, thanks. Wow, that book has its own life. I tend to say that that book has a career, and I'm just along for the ride. And I stole that from Pamela Anderson, who said, my boobs have a career, and I'm just along for the ride. And it's apropos in both instances. And that's not American Sign Language for boobs, if you're wondering. But because I'm known for this book is really the connective tissue that I have with so many readers, I tend to give people the hotel update, because people want to know, kind of the latest of what's going on. And a couple things have happened with that book that have been really remarkable to me. One was, the book was the number one book in Norway for 4 months, which is a little absurd. Like, I can assure you, at no time was I writing this book and I'm just like, oh, this is gonna rock Oslo right here. Lutefisk for everybody. It kind of blew me away, and I actually had the opportunity to do a couple book tours in Norway. And on my last book tour in Norway, my publicist, I have a Norwegian publicist, and he wanted to take me out to dinner. And he said, there's this really cool new restaurant. It has this incredible food. You gotta try it. It's called a taco. So there are tacos in Norway. You can build border fences and walls, but tacos are undefeated. So, and I jest, but that's kind of the beauty of food and sports, and in many ways, arts, whether it's performance art, literature, film, song. It brings us together, and I think that's very special in our culture right now. The other thing that's happened with Hotel is that it is now read widely in schools. So I grew up and I became homework. I have mixed feelings about this, and it wasn't like this happened overnight. It wasn't like last week no schools are reading it and now 200 high schools are reading it. It was this slow organic process, and the way I gleaned that this was happening was through summer reading. And what had happened is some high school faculty had read it for pleasure and thought, oh, I can use this in the classroom. And it began to creep onto summer reading lists. And now it's required reading in a lot of places around the country. But it started with summer reading, which is a very interesting experience in that I raised a household of teenagers, so I know how summer reading goes. The parents you understand where I'm going with this. You're picking up what I'm putting down, as my wife would say. The kids, they get their summer reading list on the last day of school, and they go home and they tuck it in their backpack, they throw the backpack in the corner of their bedroom, and it collects dust all summer long, and then like a week before school's set to begin, they text their friends like, what were you supposed to read? And they all go to this website called sparknotes.com, like Cliff Notes. But the thing is, I'm not there. And so there's this collective shriek from 10th graders all across the nation at the tail end of August. And while I'm not on SparkNotes, I am on social media and I have a website. And so now it's late August, early September, the emails start rolling in. And they're such heartfelt emails. They're like, Mr. Ford, I loved your book, Motel on the Corner of Sweet and Sour is my all-time favorite. If you could just answer these 12 questions for me. I never answer the questions. I always respond, though. It's usually like, what's the theme of your book? And I write, the theme is turn off the Xbox. Say hi to your teacher for me. But this whole homework happening, it took a weird turn when my own daughter was assigned my book in high school. Yeah, it's not cool when dad is homework. And it was that age, that perfect age where your child is hopelessly embarrassed of you. Like your parents are wildly uncool, and she's assigned my book. And what she did is she went out onto the internet and she found a bunch of tweets from students who were assigned this book. And because she found endless joy in sharing these with me, I'm going to share a few with you. This first one's from Mariah Cobb. Nobody read Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. It'll tear your heart out and you'll cry your eyes out. Hashtag stupid English class. So that feels good. This next one. Who has a study guide for Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet? Sparks Notes didn't have it. Hashtag emergency. So, there's a lot of excitement out there in the world. Anyone want to give me a good summary of Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet? I'm willing to pay in cash. So if anyone here is in high school, there's a good side hustle for you. This next one is a personal favorite. I would rather read Animal Farm every day of my life than fucking read Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. Feel the love. And her Twitter handle is like Banana Alana. It's so cute, and yet she's bringing it. And lastly, more like Hotel on the Corner of This Book Sucks Boulevard. But, Emma. What Emma doesn't realize is I am fueled creatively by the angst of teenagers. So when Emma gets that pimple on prom night, I just get stronger. So it's okay. And I have to share this one with you. This is my all-time favorite, and this is a bit longer, and it came through Instagram. And I've had, some very positive book reviews, and it's nice to make a bestseller list on occasion, but I will never have anything as amazing as this. Dear Jamie Ford, the book Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet was a really good book, up until page 369. You sick, twisted bitch. I hate you so much. Why? Why, Jay, why? Why you do that? Why you make me cry in the car on the way to ziplining? Why would you do that to all the people who were forced to read this book? At first, I hated this book, and then Henry and Keiko made me almost sort of tolerate this book. But no, you had to put in Ethel, that witch and pathetic, backstabbing, heartbreaking stealer of how the book was supposed to end. Page 369 broke my heart, like more than when my lizard died. And do you know how much I died when my lizard died? Try almost actually dying. So the only way to make it up to me is to make a sequel and make sure that Henry and Keiko end up together and have awesome Chinese and Japanese babies. P.S. I don't mean to be mean or anything, this is just my opinion. It will never get better than that. That'll be part of my obituary. And I'm showing you the salacious ones, but I do get another kind, and it's always nice when I get a tweet from a young man in high school, because boys are resistant readers. It's almost like the publishing industry has given up on young men, because like boys in high school, they've got sports, and they've got video games, and they've got hormones, and reading's it's really hard to grab them. And so when I see a tweet and it's from a young dude and I can see his photo and he probably has his, his football jersey on, he just made varsity or something like that, and he tweets something like this is the first time I was forced to read a book that I actually loved. Right? Man, that's an awe-worthy moment. I really think all of us, everyone in here, myself included, we all have what I call the gateway drug book. It's a book that's written, and when you read it, you can read it in high school, you can read it when you're 80 years old, but you read it at a time and it hits you right when you needed it, and it feels like that book was written just for you. And it really can change you. It can open neural pathways to story and literature and art. And so if I can be the gateway drug book for some young bro in high school, I really feel like I've done a small measure of good in the world. So I do cherish those moments. Oh, thank you. But I'm here to talk about a new book. The Many Daughters of Afong Moy. This book is about inherited trauma. And that sounds very heavy And so I tend to call this book my epigenetic love story, because it is a love story, and I have a deep abiding weakness for love stories, which is just strange when you're an author, because I was signing books one time at a bookstore, and a woman came up to me, and she's like, "What's your book about?" And I said, "It's a love story." And I don't think I even finished the word story, and she was just like, "Oh, God, I hate love stories." And I'm just like, wow, Valentine's Day must suck in your house. So love stories are not for everybody, but they're for me. And so that's kind of why I just lean into them. And so in this book, it's about inherited trauma as well. And I'm starting with the genetic line of a very real woman. Her name was Afong Moy. She was the first Chinese woman to come to America in 1834. And for a hot moment, she was the most famous woman in America. She performed in sold-out theaters like this, up and down the eastern seaboard, from Toronto to Cuba. She was written about in more than 200 newspapers. There were songs written about her, poems written about her. There were racing horses named after her. And she went to the White House and met President Andrew Jackson at his request. And she was a sensation. And it's really interesting because in today's culture, everyone wants to be internet famous. And she was as famous as you could be at that time. But the tragic thing is, in all of those newspaper articles talking about her life and all that she's doing, we hear from everyone but Afong. We hear only the people who have monetized her existence. And she had bound feet, and that was part of the sideshow element of her existence. And so people would, she would sing in Chinese and she would demonstrate chopsticks, but people really wanted to see her bound feet. And as far as we know, she did not have any children. And as far as we know, her story ended tragically. She was the sensation in all these newspapers, but by 1849, she's been off the stage for a number of years. And her name finally comes back, and it's noted that someone saw her living in a poorhouse in New Jersey. And she had bound feet, so she was limited in what she could do and where she could go. And I always wanted to write about this person because she's this forgotten historical figure. But I couldn't find a way to tell her story that wasn't so completely tragic. And I wanted to give her a voice. And so what I did is I gave her fictional descendants. Here's her newspaper articles where she's being celebrated. There's a wonderful play called The Chinese Lady that's been performed all over the country. And we do see her speak, and we hear her speak, and it's an interesting story. But it gently touches on the dark reality of her story. And I really went there. And so I did. I gave her a matrilineal line of descendants, going from her time in 1834, and the book goes all the way into the future a little bit, into about 2045. So it's not science fiction-y that there are, flying cars and rocket ships and things like that. Traffic just sucks a lot worse. But I've given her these other people who can echo her story, and it's about inherited trauma, and so they're all processing and addressing the alienation and the things that, the abandonment that Afong must have felt. And so these generations, there's Fei Moy, which is a Chinese nurse serving in Kunming, China with the Flying Tigers as the U.S. is entering World War II. There's Zoe Moy, who is a young girl at a boarding school in the UK, in England, called Summerhill. It was this maverick school. It was known as a school with no rules. It's still there to this day. It's kind of the school that I wish I could have gone to. There's Greta Moy, and Greta her timeline is contemporary. It's set around 2014. It's set in Seattle. She's a young .com executive working on a feminist dating platform that is actually angel invested by a billionaire who is known for his sexual assault. There's Dorothy Moy. And Dorothy really is the main character of this novel. Dorothy's story is set in 2045. She's Washington's former poet laureate, and she's someone who describes herself as breaking her own heart for a living. She's processing all of this grief and trauma that she's never been able to address. She's never been able to free herself from. She's never been able to therapeutically process because she's processing past trauma. And in that future context, I create a therapeutic modality that allows people to re-remember the past. And there's a thought that by re-remembering the past, we change the future. And the reason that Dorothy does this is because she has a daughter, a young daughter named Annabelle, who's a little bit older than a toddler. And her daughter starts exhibiting some of the same behavior that Dorothy went through as a child. And in addition to that, she starts having memories of things that are outside of her own timeline. And so it's the story within a story within a story. It's the most complicated book I've ever written. It has 6 point of view characters and 6 timelines, and it sounds kind of complicated, but I tried to leave enough breadcrumbs to walk you through the story. And so those of you that have read it and enjoyed it, I appreciate it. The one interesting timeline that I do want to address, because I don't cover it in the book, but it's worth pointing out, is Lai King Moy. Lai King's story is set in the late 1800s, around the year 1899, 1900, right in that time period. And her story is set in San Francisco. And at that time, San Francisco had a plague epidemic for 4 years. And as I'm doing this research, I'm literally writing about a plague epidemic during a global pandemic and watching things transpire outside and then reading about what happened in the past. There was a plague epidemic, and the Chinese were blamed. So they set fire to Chinatown. There was a governor of California, a man named Henry Gage. This plague epidemic lasted 4 years, and Governor Gage would not acknowledge that it was happening because he was afraid it was going to hurt California's economy and his chance for re-election. There was a doctor with a vaccine, and the doctor and the politician had a war of words in the press, with the politician accusing the doctor of trying to scare people, of having a profit motive. Does this sound at all familiar? It was, and I think I mentioned the Chinese were blamed as well. And it was wild and also equally distressing and a little depressing to see this happen. But the book is about repetitions of behavior, of how we're in many ways trapped in cycles of action and reaction and inaction. And we replicated how that public health problem was handled almost step by step, 120 years later. It was wild to see this happen. And again, the book is about inherited trauma, but epigenetics is the idea that we pass these events from one generation to the other. And I became just kind of enraptured with this idea when I read an article in 2013 about a study that was done at Emory University where researchers, they took lab animals, in this case they were mice, and they introduced a cherry blossom fragrance as they electrified the floor. Sorry, mice, that's what happened. And they quickly conditioned the mice to where they could just spray that fragrance and the mice would have a panic fear reaction without the shock. And then they found 2, 3, 4, 5 generations later, the descendants of that original set of laboratory animals who had never smelled that scent had never been shocked. When they introduced that smell, they had the same panic fear reaction. So they had literally inherited that trauma. And it's an idea that's not hard to sell. It's been in our culture in certain areas. Certainly Native American communities, indigenous communities have talked about inherited trauma for 100+ years, maybe longer. There have been some really compelling studies with the descendants of Holocaust survivors and Holocaust victims that are showing different health outcomes than the mean average. There was even a study of women who were more than 7 months pregnant when they watched the Twin Towers fall on 9/11, and the differing levels of depression and anxiety that their children have than the mean average. And it's easier to focus on the negative things because they manifest in a more visible way. But I couldn't stop thinking that if we inherit bad things, do we inherit good things? Do we inherit levels of empathy? Do we inherit compassion? Do we inherit the ability to love, or in many ways, the inability to love and care for other people? And the way this really jumped out to me and my family was with my son, Taylor. And he was probably 12 years old. And he came up to me and he said, "Dad, have you ever heard of this band called Van Halen?" And I'm like, "Why, yes, I have heard of this band. Like, where have you heard of this band?" And he had stumbled onto this band on YouTube, and he had just decided this is the greatest band of all time. And unbeknownst to him, that was the first concert I ever went to. And I know it could be just a silly coincidence, but he inherited my overbite and my hairline. Why not my questionable taste in hair metal? Like, it's possible. But when you talk about inheriting these things, those of you that have grandchildren or children, you often see it. You sort of see those echoes where you look at your grandchild and go, he's sitting the same way my father used to sit in that chair. He's reacting in the same way. And so I think we're connected in a way to those who came after us, and connected in those who come, before us and after us, in ways that we really don't appreciate or realize. I really feel, after doing all this research and talking to geneticists, as well as talking to several Buddhist priests, because there are some interesting corollaries of inherited behavior, is that I sort of came to the conclusion that, we're not flowers that bloom and die. We're perennials that are expressed in every generation, and it keeps on going. And I find that very hopeful. It's also a little scary, because if your parents made some bad decisions in life, you may want to be wary of making those yourself. But that's really what this book is about. It's a book that, when I wrote it, it was really different for me. For those of you that read my earlier books, this is I call it my big box of crayons. There's a lot going on in this book. And my previous publisher, this book was too different for them. They weren't crazy about it. And so I had to leave. I could either stay in the box of expectation that they had laid out for me and write the books that they wanted me to keep writing, or I could do my own thing. And I decided to do my own thing. And I had to find a new home for my imaginary friends. That's how I describe it. And fortunately, I found another publisher who really liked it. And the book, I was unsure, especially because my publisher didn't want it. I wasn't sure if anyone would want this book, if anyone would get this book, let alone be invited to an evening like this with a sold-out crowd in this theater. So I'm very grateful. But as authors, we we are plagued with imposter syndrome. We were always like, really me? Like, did someone cancel and that's why you want my book? Those kind of things. Just always chronically in our heads because that's part of the author experience. But luckily the book, it did have a moment. And also inherited trauma is finally having a moment. I wrote about it at a time where when people asked me what I was writing about, I'd say I'm writing about inherited trauma, and they'd go, okay, interesting. And the only person that really knew what I was working on was my therapist. I told her, and she's like, oh, wow. And it's been a thing in therapeutic circles forever, and there's therapeutic modalities to address it. Gwyneth Paltrow is a big fan of something called family constellation theory, so Gwyneth Paltrow is on board. Who knew? But it's entering our culture, it's having a little zeitgeist moment, and it's coming from a lot of different directions, which I find really, really interesting. But what was also interesting was that, I'm gonna jump to Q&A, but the question that comes up a lot, I just wanna address right away is, the book was chosen for the Today Show. And I always wondered, how does that happen? And so often when I do book events, people are like, how do you get on the Today Show? How does that work? I'm gonna tell you. What happens is, and I had no idea how Oprah's book club, how Reese Witherspoon's book club, how any of that works. Publishers, they take the books that they think are notable, and they send early copies to people like Jenna Bush Hager and Reese Witherspoon and Oprah. And if they like them, then they might invite you on. But what happens first are a couple strange things. Long before this happened, book wasn't published yet, I was doing a Zoom with a library in Kentucky. And this is something I do all the time. And I'm Zooming, there's like 40, 50 people, there's a librarian, they're patrons, and we're talking about my first book. And I get off the Zoom and my phone rings, and it's my publicist from Simon & Schuster. And she says, okay, we didn't want to tell you because we were afraid it would freak you out, but there were people from the Today Show on that Zoom watching you. And I'm like, who? And she said, all of them. There were 9 people watching me. And I realized what they're doing is they're making sure I'm housebroken for morning television, They want to make sure, how crazy is this person? But it definitely makes you paranoid. It was kind of the joke in our house. Like, I'd order a pizza, and then the pizza delivery guy would go away and looked at my wife and like, that might have been someone from the Today Show. See if I put pineapple on my pizza. But that led to an interview with 2 of their producers. And they ask these very, I think they think they're being clever, but I know they're asking these questions just to see, do I have any problematic behavior in my life? Like, how many demons are in my closet? They're asking me about my children and my parents and my childhood. And I'm just like, okay, guys, it's clear that you're trying to figure out who I am, and I can sum it up for you in one sentence. And they lean in. And I said, when I was in the 4th grade, my parents sent me to poetry camp. And they're like, yeah, we know who this guy is. It's like, collected comic books, yes. Played Dungeons and Dragons, yes. Had a girlfriend in college, imaginary, yes. No. I passed the test and then went and did my thing. And the only rock star moment I've ever had was given to me by the Today Show because I walk out of my hotel and they picked me up in a limousine and they drove me 3 blocks to the studio. So evidently the authors get lost or something like that. So, and with that, I would be delighted to answer any questions you might have. And I know they passed out some cards for people to write questions on, and I think there were some other questions that were already ready. So you ask, I will answer. My wife says I have this thing called terminal honesty. So if you ask, I'll probably just tell you. So might as well go for it.
Thank you, Jamie. The first question is, this novel has a strong woman's voice throughout. What experiences or relationships helped you write so authentically in a gender other than your own?
Oh, nice. I would get this question at every stop on my book tour. And fortunately, it was always in a complimentary fashion. One woman even stood up and she's like, "How are you in here? You're in here!" And my second book, Songs of Willow Frost, that's the book where I started to get a reputation as the dude that writes women in a way that female readers do not cringe. And I cringe too when guys don't do it well. I would walk into interviews for Songs of Willow Frost, and my name is Jamie, and they hadn't met me, and I'd walk in, they're like, "You're a guy!" I'm like, "Yes, sorry, I can't help it. Got a Y chromosome, we're gonna lean into that thing." But I have 6 female point of view characters. There are 2 men in that genealogy. I left them out because men of every age, from the dawn of time to right now, have always had it easier than women. And the point of view belongs to the person with the most interesting problems, and women have always had more interesting problems. Interesting problems. But it didn't seem odd for me because I was always that kid that, I was that boy in high school that cried at sad movies and sad books and sad Burger King commercials. And, if you're that boy in high school, and I went to the school that was like a football powerhouse, and if you're the boy in high school that cries at sad movies, it's not an asset in high school, but that level of empathy, it became my superpower as a writer, honestly. And so part of it is I have 2 older sisters, I have 4 daughters, I went to poetry camp. It was interesting because as a man, the things that I thought were all my weaknesses as a teenager, they really served me well later. And even in high school, I would take classes. I didn't realize that they were classes that young women generally took and not young men. So I signed up for practical family living, and I walk in, and it's like 28 young women, me and the one queer boy in our school. And my friends are like, "Oh, that's awesome, you're there with all these babes." And I'm just like, I just like the class. It was like what I was interested in. So maybe I just have wired a little differently, overactive empathy muscles, processing the trauma of both sides of my family.
As a person very interested in their own genealogy and the traumas that have been passed down through generations, I would love to do what Dorothy is able to do to heal her ancestors' trauma. How much does your own family history inform the stories in Afong Moy, and was the book healing to write?
Oh, wow. I was having this conversation at dinner. In the book, there's a methodology that combines epigenetics and optogenetics. Optogenetics was something that they were working on at MIT about 7 or 8 years ago, where they figured out how to transplant a memory from one lab animal to another. And I can explain the nuts and bolts of how they did that. But I combined the two because, in a way, Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction author, he wrote about artificial satellites in the 30s, and it wasn't until 1957 that Sputnik went up. So he presaged this thing, and there's a part of me, I'm like, man, I hope someone invents this, because I could really use it. I think the world would be a better place if we all addressed our childhood trauma. But, and this is a very truthful personal moment for me. I had a very traumatic childhood, and I really thought that by writing these books, and in many ways processing the relationships I had with my parents and things like that on the page, it would mitigate my trauma. It never did. And I thought by writing this very trauma-heavy book would, poof, I processed all my stuff. And it really didn't. And it's something that really, about a year ago, I went away to what I call trauma camp. And it's and lots of people especially celebrities and stuff, they go to these places, no one ever talks about it. So I tend to talk about it. And it was a place of intensive outpatient therapy, like really cutting edge modalities. And it was interesting, some of the books that I read to research trauma, like the book The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Vanderkolk. He is one of the people that created this trauma camp. I didn't know that until I walked in and I see his name on the wall. And so, yeah, it's, in many ways, writing about trauma was like monetizing my trauma. In the same way Afong Moy's existence was monetized, but it didn't bring her comfort or relief. And I had to get that in a different fashion. But it really, if anyone ever considers intensive therapy or going away to trauma camp, as I call it, to tell you about what trauma camp was like, this is my little anecdote. It was in Arizona. You fly in and they have someone pick you up at the airport. And there were 3 of us being picked up at this time. It was in the evening. And none of us wanted to talk to anyone. And we did out of respect to other people, but it's also just very personal and strange and weird. Like I had a hoodie and I wanted to put my hoodie up and just in the van. None of us talked. On the way back to the airport, there were 15 of us in that van, and we were like, trauma camp, woohoo! It was awesome. We had a great, great group cathartic healing experience. So anyway, that's my endorsement.
So great. Okay, the next question is, there is a strong Buddhist thread in your novel. What is your personal experience with Buddhism?
My personal experience with Buddhism is, anyone ever see the comedian Ali Wong? Like, she talks about how, she has scrolls in her home with Chinese and Vietnamese writing, and she has no idea what it says. I grew up in that household too, where we had statuary and things like that, and it was culturally there, but my family weren't practicing Buddhists. But I was always fascinated, and I had interesting moments. I was at the Kubota Garden in Seattle, and I was taking a tour, and the gentleman, and this is years ago, giving me the tour, he does this for fun, and he's a Buddhist priest. He's also a faculty at Seattle University. And he asked me, like, do you have any, where are you at as far as your beliefs and faith and things like that? And I said, I think I'm a deist agnostic Shinto Jesuit. Like, I'm a little bit of everything, and with the option to change over time. And he said, I think that means you're a Buddhist. And I took that to heart. And later he was one of the Buddhist priests that I interviewed for this book, because I'm writing about our descendants inheriting a part of us. And there is a weird corollary. If you think of karma as the things we do in this life affecting our next incarnation, what if that next incarnation is not us but our children? And so it really felt like Buddhism and this epigenetics idea, they were 2 sides of the same coin to me. So I just got back from a trip to Southeast Asia, and it's just, to go to Bangkok, which is a city of 9 million people, and no one honks, it's because of Buddhism. People are chill. It's like, there's just a different vibe that we could definitely learn and absorb that I think would make life a little more pleasant for all of us. So I'm open to the idea.
Thank you. Is the whole book from Dorothy's perspective? Is it really just Dorothy imagining the lives of her ancestors?
Oh, good question. I really see this book as a book that when you get to the end, and for better or worse, you might have more questions than resolution. I think it does wrap up in a very tight way, but I wanted it to be something where you really think about it, about the characters and perhaps your own life. Everyone has different opinions about this, and when you put a book out there, it's like drawing part of a circle, and the reader completes the circuit. And at that point, it belongs to the reader. So I always say if someone feels this way and someone feels that way, you're both right, because you're both entitled to your own interpretation of the book. As the author, I really I really do see all the characters as just a different genetic expression of Afong all the way to Dorothy. So they're part and parcel all the same, to me.
Each character's story was so fascinating and rich, it could have been its own novel. What was your process for writing the book? Did each character's story come to you once you had decided on the overall plot, or did they exist prior to the structuring of the book?
Oh, wow. I tend to work from a premise and a synopsis. So I had an 8-page synopsis. It's not literally an outline, but it was like each character and sort of the arc of their story. And I didn't know how I was going to tell it, but that was the idea. And I knew my beginning with Faye, and I knew my ending. And if I don't know my ending, I get writer's block. It's like driving with no destination in mind. You can make great time, but then you're like, what am I doing in Walla Walla? And so that destination is really important to me. And normally, all my books are split narratives. My other books, I would just write in a linear fashion. Even though I'm jumping back in time, I just go start to finish. And I tried that with this book. I got about 80 pages in, and I was just juggling too many things. It's like trying to juggle, a bowling ball and a chainsaw and a kitten, and I couldn't do it. So this is the first time that I roughed out each narrative in its entirety, and then I wove them all together and rewrote the whole thing. That's kind of the process.
Okay. As I read your book, I kept track of quotes and references from at least 20 different poems and poets. I'm curious if you write poetry and how your love of poetry has shaped your fiction writing, and in particular, The Many Daughters of Afong Moy.
Oh. Yeah, I love poetry. If anyone's in a book club, and I've been in a book club for 11 years, I always recommend add a book of poetry or a graphic novel. It's kind of a nice change up. I do love poetry, and I love poets who are still alive. In high school, we're fed dead poets, and that's fine, but it's hard to relate to a poem that was written in the 15th century and things like that, at least in high school. At college, it's a whole other different level of maturity. And so it is expressing my love for poetry. And a poet that is my absolute favorite, well, I have two favorites. One is a poet named Anis Mojgani, and he lives in Portland. He's Oregon's poet laureate, 2-time poet laureate. Anis is incredible. But my absolute favorite poet is a poet named Andrea Gibson. Yeah. Some love for Andrea, right? Andrea Gibson. I encourage everyone in this room, if you don't think you like poetry, go to YouTube, type in Andrea Gibson, whatever performance comes up, grab a box of Kleenex and press play, because you're going to cry. Their poetry is incredibly personal and incredibly beautiful. And Andrea had cancer. The cancer has come back, and she is posting these lovely, overwhelmingly positive things about her cancer coming back and how that's changed how she looks at the world and how she looks at other people and herself. And the grace with which she moves through this as a poet is staggering. It'll change you. I guarantee it. So I'm a big fan, and that's why I put dead poets, live poets. I mention Andrea Gibson in the book.
Yeah, in one of our book discussions that was part of One Book, someone who couldn't be here tonight wanted me to ask you how you chose the particular poems that were in the book.
Oh, sometimes the poems, I want them to be sort of an echo of the scene, which gives me an excuse to read a bunch of poetry when I should be writing. Like, I want to put something in here, and I need a perfect line, and so I'll just go through poems, and okay, I think that works. But honestly, sometimes I will begin my writing day by watching a spoken word piece by some of my favorite poets, like Anis, like Andrea. I'm assuming most people here saw the performance with Tracy Chapman and Luke Combs, the Grammys. And it was moving, right? I mean, it's just, and you don't even know why. I mean, you could analyze it later, but I watched that over and over again in the Seoul airport, Korea, just crying at my gate because it was so powerful. Andrea Gibson's pieces are like that. And I like to start my day in a real emotional place. And so often I'll start my writing day by just listening to one of their performances. And it just kind of gets my heart in the right groove. And then I just unleash the Kraken.
Okay. What was the biggest challenge writing this book? A specific character or timeline or other?
Oh, the biggest challenge was, honestly, it's more of a business thing, but when Random House really didn't want this book, I thought maybe my career is over. I'm like, oh, okay, well, this maybe I had a good run. And it's a weird moment where basically my previous publisher would back a truck up to my yard and just dump a pile of money on my lawn if I kept writing a book that was in the same box of expectation. And the hardest thing was just walking away from that, just going, that's guaranteed, this is unknown. And I just can't, I don't do it for the money. I do it because I like to write, and I enjoy the process. Writing's really hard, so if you don't enjoy the process, because the process can really, be hard, you're in it for the wrong reasons. And so it was the first time in my career where I didn't have a publisher, I didn't have an editor. My agent said, we're going to be a free agent, once again, starting fresh. And in case you didn't notice, there was a billboard in Times Square with this book on it. So that, I think of Random House, my previous editor, walking to work and seeing that billboard. And my next book will be a autobiography of my time in the publishing industry called Schadenfreude. I'm not above a little enjoyment in that moment. So, yeah, that was hard. Just, and it happens a lot. There was an incredible book that won the National Book Award called Hell of a Book, and it was written by Jason Mott, who I admire greatly. And he had the same problem, is his editor did not want that book. And so he had to leave and roll the dice, and it worked out because he won a National Book Award. So sometimes you just got to follow your heart.
That's great. Yeah. Would you consider continuing the stories of any of the characters from this book? Actually, we had a couple questions that were like this.
Yeah, I do get lots of emails and things, and there are specific characters that people really identify with, and like, I want a whole book on that person. I probably wouldn't, just because I can only screw it up at this point. No one wants Casablanca 2 or Going with the Wind 2 or something like that. Sometimes, I don't do the algebra in my mind of like, okay, if I write a sequel, I can build a swimming pool in my backyard or something like. I don't think that way, so I just go off on tangents to the stories that feel like I should write, that I have personal reasons for writing.
What was the weirdest thread you found yourself researching for this book? And then I think this is giving an example. Dating websites with a smiley face.
Yeah. There are weird coincidences. My wife always feels like not even my wife, myself, I freak out sometimes because I'll plot something out, I'll write it, and then I'll find something historical that mirrors it. I had a character named Faye. She's a nurse, Chinese nurse serving with the Flying Tigers. I had written most of Faye's scenes when I stumbled upon a newspaper article there was one Chinese nurse who served with the Flying Tigers. And there's a love story behind her story. She fell in love with the pilot. The pilot went home, came back, and she was gone. She got caught up in the Cultural Revolution eventually, and survived a bunch of horrible things, lived into her late 80s. And then when she died, her family found a box of letters from this pilot who had been looking for her all these years. So there's things like that that just sort of pop out, and you're just like, wow, I've somehow, me and the universe sort of did a high five somewhere, like it was, that kind of stuff is special. I sort of lost the plot of the question. What was the question again?
What was the weirdest thread that you found yourself researching for the book?
I joined Tinder for like a day. That was weird. That was weird. And I was at an artist residency in Saratoga Springs, New York, and I'm writing this book, and I'm doing research, and I'm like, okay, sign up for this. And I'm like, wow, that's a whole weird subculture that's becoming main culture. And I have my daughter, her fiance, she met on Tinder. So the world, operates differently. Yeah, that was weird. It was the casual way you can, fall for someone or throw them away is a little disheartening. I like the decorum of movies like Casablanca. There's the romantic in me. I like movies when love was all-consuming and not just all-consummating, and there's a difference. So I'm a little bit of a throwback.
Okay, I am wondering why Dorothy's memory of Afong Moy is from the perspective of an observer and not a memory from within Afong Moy.
Oh, because I wanted to. No, I thought about this a lot because it would make sense to do that, but story structure-wise, without getting into the mechanics of the story, it was more problematic for me to do it that way. It would create thoughts and feelings in a direction that I didn't want the reader to go. And so at that point, I did separate the two so that it's almost like that, a break in personality, if you will. Not literally, she's not schizophrenic or anything like that, but it was a moment of her recapturing her own identity, independent of the locus of all of her pain and anxiety.
Okay, this will be our final question.
Oh, cool.
Thank you for this beautiful book and story. Will we see stage, film, series adaptations of the book?
Ooh.
And happy Lunar New Year.
Oh, yeah. Today's February 10th, the Lunar New Year. Gungi Fat Choi. It's just the comedian Ronnie Chang says, it doesn't mean Happy New Year, it means hope you get rich. So it's kind of true. Yeah, the book was actually optioned before it was ever published, which was a remarkable thing to happen. I know this is the last question, and I need to wrap it up, but Jenna Bush Hager of the Today Show, she created a production company and began optioning some of the books that she chooses for her book club. And I was the first book chosen. And I didn't know how to feel about that, because I didn't really like her father, didn't vote for him. It's you have that moment where I'm like, okay, is this the moment where I'm selling out and I don't know it? Like, what am I doing? Do I make it was very strange for me. But she really, none of us want to be known by our dads. Imagine being her, and just having to, everyone associate the two and never be her own independent person. And I think she's created her own identity, which is very special and hard to do for someone in her shoes. When I first talked to Jenna about, and again, I'm like, I wasn't sure, because you never know with celebrity book clubs. Do they read the books? Is it, do the minions read them and all that stuff? we talked for like 90 minutes about other people's books. She reads everything. She's a massive, diehard lover of literature. And she said she wanted to option it. As she said, I will settle for nothing less than a female Asian screenwriter. And I thought, that sounds great, but I've heard that before with my first book, and I was let down. So I didn't get too excited. And then when Jenna and her producing partner sent over the list of screenwriters that they were interviewing, there were 30 names, all women, all Asian. And I was like, okay, you got me, Jenna, you got me. You won me over. And we chose a screenwriter named Nancy Wan, who is brilliant, and I have seen a rough pilot script for a series. I really like it. I've seen scripts for other things that I've created that I am not crazy about, and I'm a critic. It's like I don't want someone to you're selling your baby to the circus, and you worry about what the outcome is going to be. But I really love the script so far. They have to sell it to one of the streamers, and right now that whole industry is contracting, so it's harder than ever to sell it. So it may never go anywhere, or it might. So just sort of collectively cross our fingers. It's been marvelous to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie.